Hi, welcome to the third clip of this week's lecture on colonialism, in which I'll cover the first of those 3 points that I made in the previous clip about the fact that anthropologists, interlocutors, the people that anthropologists have sought to engage with and seek to understand and study, have in the vast majority been implicated in the project of colonialism. They have been colonial or are continue to be post-colonial subjects, and that this puts anthropology very much in the vicinity and into dialogue with post-colonial theory. Now, I can't remember whose face my face is covering, or whose book cover my face is covering this week. The usual problem that the little icon that has me talking kind of interferes with a PowerPoint. You can find that out, a bit like a Christmas advent calendar, by looking at the PowerPoint that is without my face on Moodle. So there's going to be a little surprise for you. But I've put here a series of scholars who are, key in this field. There's so many more that I could have put up. I've also put some activists like Angela Davis. You may notice a person speaking into the microphone in the bottom of the slide. There's CLR James to the left of her, the gentleman with the white hair, the great historian from Trinidad Tobago in the Caribbean, a Marxist historian who wrote this fantastic book called The Black Jacobins, one of my favorite books as a person who works in the Caribbean, talking about the Haitian Revolution. It's a remarkable event that happened almost concurrently with the French Revolution, the only slave-led revolution, a completely extraordinary event to take place in Haiti in the late 18th century. Above CLR James, there's a series of people. Frantz Fanon, the great post-colonial theorist from Martinique, writing in Algeria. His book, The Wretched of the Earth, Black Skin, White Masks. Homi Bhabha, a great intellectual from India. Dipesh Chakrabarty, next to him, wrote this famous book called Provincializing Europe. What a nice title. Our colleague here at UCL, how privileged we are to have Paul Gilroy, the gentleman in the center, who, the author of the Black Atlantic. Spivak is this great theorist from the United States next to her. Edward Said at the end there, who is one of the people that we'll be working with. So a whole array of people working in this broad and multifarious field called post-colonial studies, post-colonial theory, all of whom have in common the desire to understand this historical current of colonialism, its effects, not only on the people that were subject to it, but also on the very intellectual projects that emanated out of colonialism, of which anthropology is one. So there's a radical, critical intellectual agenda attached to this field of post-colonial theory, and that's really part of what we're looking at in this clip. So sorry about the heavy text, heaviness of text on this slide, but there's various kind of points I wanted to cover. So what is the relevance of post-colonial theory from the point of view of the discipline of anthropology, which is the kind of point of departure of this course that we're doing, right? So the project, a kind of fundamental premise that I think you need to take into account really in trying to engage with the question of post-colonial theory is this idea that the project of knowledge as such and the project of colonialism overlap. So when I talk about the project of knowledge, what I mean is this idea that is so central to the Enlightenment in Europe, that we've been returning to again and again in this course as a point of departure for so much that takes place in a university, any university, including that of UCL, is this idea of building a systematic body of knowledge in different fields: physics, chemistry, philosophy, biology, music, fine arts, history of art, history, and anthropology, sociology, and so on, right? These disciplines, and the idea that we can develop a systematic body of knowledge, right? And understand the world around us and gain a purchase on it, understand how it ticks, perhaps in order to make it better, you know, develop vaccines for coronavirus or what have you, right? This is all the work of knowledge. And this project, which has such an emancipatory dimension to it for many, certainly it did in the Enlightenment, is also imbricated and perhaps is an aspect of the development of colonialism. So this is a central insight here, right? So the question then for post-colonial study is how to undermine this link, pass this somehow apart, and create spaces in this project of knowledge in which the perspective of the colonized can also be expressed and have a kind of radical impact. Right? This is really the ask of post-colonial studies in many ways, right? Of post-colonial theory. If we understand that the project of knowledge is imbricated with the project of colonialism, then how do we create spaces within that project of knowledge? How do we shift it? How do we distort it? How do we break it open in order to allow and create spaces for people who were at the receiving end of colonialism and who continue perhaps to be at the receiving end of neocolonialism to have an impact within it, right? To speak back to it and within it, or across it. I don't know what the right spatial metaphor is, right? So this broad agenda, if we can call it that, involves at least four, I think, important aspects, the four connected projects. One is to articulate the constitution and dynamics of the hegemony. This is an important word that comes from the Italian Marxist theorist Antonio Gramsci. So, I mean, I can't give you a kind of very quick definition of hegemony or lecture on hegemony, but roughly the idea of the forms of knowledge that are taken for granted. For something to become hegemonic is the way in which power is exercised through knowledge by claiming that this power is something that can be, that this knowledge is something that we can take for granted, right? So we might say, for example, that the idea that there are two genders, male and female, is hegemonic, right? It's something that so much discourse around us takes for granted. The fact that if you go to a public building or to a bar or to a restaurant, there is a male toilet and a female toilet, or lavatory, or whatever you call it, loo, shows the hegemony of that distinction, right? A hegemony that a whole array of people might want to question, might want to react against, right? So how does to articulate the hegemony of the colonial perspective, how does it get constituted, right? How does colonial knowledge become hegemonic, right? From what position is knowledge produced? And what kind of effects does the knowledge that is produced from a colonial position? We talked last week about positionality in relation to the feminist work of Donna Haraway, right? This question of positionality is also central here, right? So this is a project for post-colonial theory to articulate the ways in which that hegemony of colonial knowledge is constituted, how it works, what its dynamics are. So, for example, one of the most famous books in the field of post-colonial theory is the book of Edward Said, a theorist that is most famous for his book called Orientalism. And effectively, for Said, Orientalism is really a description of the episteme, the formatting of knowledge claims that European scholarship made about what was defined as the Orient, the other of the East, which for Edward Said is central to the constitution of the dominance of the West. So the discourse that was produced in Western universities, in European universities, in the 18th, 19th, 20th century, about other cultures of the Middle East, of China, of Japan, of other parts of the world, Latin America, all parts of the world that in different ways have been embroiled and in some cases subjugated through the dynamics of colonialism. That form of othering knowledge, right, the caricatures of Oriental societies that were produced through this Orientalist knowledge were central to the constitution of the colonial superiority of the West for Edward Said. Right? So these forms of Orientalism are part of colonial dominance. And understanding how that works is laying bare the dynamics that underpin colonial and indeed racist, white supremacist discourses and forms of power. Right? So articulating that is a really important aspect of post-colonial theory. A second aspect of this is really this question of subjectivity that I already mentioned. Exploring ways in which the colonial situation, the dynamics of colonialism, produce particular kinds of subjectivities, particular kinds of subjects. Now, I'll remind you here the very brief kind of foray that we made in a previous lecture into the work of Michel Foucault. Michel Foucault has been really, really important, actually, as a reference point in the field of post-colonial theory. Indeed, Said is deeply influenced by Foucault. But this idea that we saw that knowledge constitutes a particular form, and power constitutes particular forms of subject, that we saw most classically in this idea of the way that a prison might be organized according to this Bentham model of the panopticon, right? And the ways in which surveillance produces particular kinds of subjects, right? Subjects that self-survey themselves in this case, right? That kind of idea about the power to produce particular kinds of subjects, and in this case colonial power to produce particular kinds of subjects, is central to post-colonial theory. And the greatest example perhaps here would be the work of Frantz Fanon, whom I mentioned in the previous clip in relation to just the picture of him and the cover of his book. So in The Wretched of the Earth and in the Black Skin, White Masks book, Fanon develops extremely sophisticated arguments, informed also by his practice as a psychiatrist, of the ways in which colonial domination produces particular kinds of subjectivity, the ways in which it dehumanizes people, its forms of racialization, crucially, and crucially the ways in which language, in a way, has effects on, so colonial language, particularly the use of French, for example, in North Africa, creates particular forms of conditions of possibility for the kinds of subjects that, for example, Algerians or other North Africans can be, the kinds of things that they can say and think, the kinds of thoughts that can be articulated, have to be refracted through the prism of the language of the colonists. And that creates a particular complex dynamic that is incredibly powerful in the way that it formats people for Frantz Fanon. And indeed, attentiveness to language is incredibly important in this whole field of post-colonial theory, and so much of it has been developed actually in relation to the study of literature, of colonial and post-colonial literature. So Fanon as an example of the many ways in which post-colonial theorists have sought to understand forms of colonial and post-colonial subjectivity. A third area of concern, a third kind of project of post-colonial theory, is really going beyond the diagnosis. If you like, the first and the second points that I've made are questions of diagnosis of the post-colonial, the colonial and the post-colonial condition. The third and the fourth point that I want to make are really going beyond diagnosis into a more kind of active way in which post-colonial theorists have sought to shift the ground of theorizing itself, to reimagine what social theory might actually be if we take into account the facts and dynamics of colonialism and post-colonialism. So a kind of more active pushback, if you like, against these structures of domination, and ways of reimagining what knowledge might even be in the light of these considerations, right? So the third point, the third project that I wanted to highlight is this attempt to open up spaces in which colonial hegemony and subjectivity can be subverted or resisted. So, for example, that book I mentioned earlier by Chakrabarty on provincializing Europe is a book in which Chakrabarty attempts to find a kind of alternative conceptual resources for articulating a kind of anti-colonial horizon, in this case particularly written from the point of view of South Asian history and historiography, and related to this incredibly influential, important group of historians primarily, emanating from South Asia, from India and elsewhere in South Asia, that's come to be known as the Subaltern Studies School of History, right? So coming out of that tradition, Chakrabarty is developing a kind of book that might articulate ways in which Europe can be provincialized. It stops being seen as the position out of which knowledge emanates, including, of course, anthropology, and becomes just one region of the globe. And the whole globe gets involved in a dynamic way in the production of knowledge, and in so doing redefines what counts as knowledge in the first place. Finally, a fourth aspect of the post-colonial theory project, which I think is also really designed not just to diagnose the condition of colonialism, but also to shift and change it and to imagine alternatives to it, is really a project of kind of breaking down the us-them binary that so much of the power of the colonial knowledge and hegemony is based upon. So the argument that Said made about the need that the West as a colonial force had to create a mirror of itself in this act of orientalizing other cultures, right, and caricaturing them in particular ways, you know, these kind of stereotypical forms of knowledge about the other that are still so incredibly powerful. All you need to do is read a newspaper or look at the internet or turn your TV on to see the incredible power of these othering forms of knowledge, these binary kind of us versus them, the West versus the rest, that kind of underpin like a structural dynamic, you know, a kind of binary opposition very much along the lines that Levi-Strauss would theorize it, you know, us versus them, underpinning colonial knowledge. So if that is required for the colonial project of knowledge to get off the ground, as people like Said would argue, well then are there ways in which we can break that down? So for example, the work of, I mentioned Homi Bhabha and his emphasis on hybridity, on ambivalence, ambiguity. He talks, borrowing from literary theory, of the third space that can be developed as a space of ambiguity, in which the distinction between the colonizer and the colonized might be rendered more complex and blurred, right? The work of our colleague here at UCL, Paul Gilroy, in his famous book, The Black Atlantic, he has many other great books. There Ain't No Black in the Union Jack is another real, really important book of his, talking about British society in particular, as a British author himself. But in The Black Atlantic, he talks about this transnational kind of space of movement that cuts across the Black Atlantic as a kind of space that cuts across racialized national identities, in which cultural forms such as music, for example, and this emphasis on motility and movement, right, which has a dark history in the slave trade, but also a whole array of other dynamics, right? This resistance to allowing the kind of Black Atlantic or transatlantic slave trade to define the space in which black, capital B, kind of subjectivities can be formulated. And for example, this emphasis on cultural forms such as music or dance, as our colleague in this department, in UCL Anthropology department, Helene Kringelbach-Nouveau, some of you may know, is working on exactly these kinds of forms of musical translation, in her case from West Africa to France and so on. This movement of cultural forms creating hybrid, complex identities rather than a kind of us-them dynamic that colonialism presupposes. I just wanted also to highlight the incredible and sometimes uncomfortably or complex, sometimes not uncomfortable but contradictory in some ways, we can discuss this if you want, influence that Marxism has had in the development of these ideas, as well as post-structuralism. I mentioned Foucault, a great post-structuralist thinker, and postmodernism. So this emphasis on hybridity, on overcoming the master narratives of modernity, is part of a kind of postmodernist impulse in which post-colonial theory has participated in many ways. Just to close this slide very, very briefly, I've just put up 4 very famous books. There's so many more and many more recent books that I could have put up to illustrate the ways in which anthropologists have picked up these ideas from post-colonial theory and refracted them in all sorts of interesting ways. I won't go into the detail of each of these arguments. I've already mentioned Sidney Mintz's kind of history of sugar and the way in which he says that both working class culture in Europe, but also, of course, the societies and cultures in the Caribbean can only be understood in the context of the colonial trade in sugar and of course the influence of the trade in slaves on that, but also of course all of this understood in the context of capitalism. So this is, one example of an anthropologist engaging with colonial and post-colonial theory. I put here Michael Tausig's Mimesis and Alterity, fascinating ways in which he talks, for example, about Kuna people in Panama engaging in their ritual practices with kind of imitating images of colonialism, including that image that's on the cover of that record player of his master's voice, if you remember that particular record label feature in the ritual practices of Kuna people in Panama, and how this actually is a way of engaging with the power and actually engaging with and pushing and drawing on the power of colonial forces in Central America. The book by Nicholas Dirks talking about how the caste system in India, which is so often part of Orientalist discourse about South Asia, kind of emphasizes the importance of caste. I think I mentioned the great French anthropologist Louis Dumont and his book Homo Hierarchicus, where he draws on kind of Vedic accounts of the caste system, this hierarchy of the castes in South Asia, and is kind of presented as a kind of primordially Indian way of thinking and of imagining what human beings are like. Well, Nicholas Dirks thoroughly deconstructs such approaches by showing that actually the development of caste is completely intertwined with British colonial rule in India, and actually caste became thoroughly institutionalized and solidified through colonial administration. So paradoxically, it wasn't that the colonists arrived and found these South Asian caste-like structures in any simple way, but actually colonialism in many important ways precipitated those very structures that then became orientalized as somehow being essentially Indian, right? So again, this pushback against essentialism is characteristic to these post-colonialist way of thinking. Anne Stoller, anthropologist from the United States, looks at the culture of colonialism itself and seeks to kind of open up the black box of the colonizers and the cultural and social forms that they inhabited as part of deconstructing and understanding what happens in colonial dynamics. And from a feminist point of view, lays particular emphasis on the gendered differentiation between colonial structures. There's nothing homogeneous about colonialism, not only in its effects, but also in its sources, right? So there's class and gender dimensions to colonialism that we ignore at our peril in seeking to understand them. Okay, I leave this clip there. It's been quite long already. I apologize for that, but quite a lot of ground to cover. Hopefully the next one will be nice and snappy in order then to get to the conversation with Ashraf Hock in the final one. See you in the next one.